El Paso is the American city that most tells us about our nation's immigration battles today, how it's been this gateway, this critical gateway into the land that would become the United States long before Ellis Island ever existed. And it's been this, portal for Mexican and Chinese laborers and Black cowboys and white entrepreneurs, who have built the Southwest as we know it.
This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Jazmine Ulloa. Jazmine is a national reporter who covers immigration for the New York Times. She's also the author of the new book, El Paso, 5 Families and 100 Years of Blood, Migration, Race, and Memory. Born and raised in El Paso, Jazmine brings both a journalist discipline and a personal connection to the story, weaving together archival research, oral histories, and her own family background to explore how this border community has shaped the broader story of the United States. What makes Jazmine's work especially compelling is the path she took to get here. She started reporting as a teenager, crossing the border with her grandmother to interview families affected by violence, real high-stakes journalism while she was still in high school. From there, she worked her way up through local papers across Texas, covering crime, courts, and immigration, eventually moving into national political reporting and earning her role at the New York Times. It's a career built the old-fashioned way: curiosity, extreme hard work, and a clear sense of purpose. In this conversation, Jazmine and I focus on the long, layered history of El Paso and the surrounding borderlands, how people, cultures, and economies have moved through this region for generations, shaping the Southwest in ways that often go unrecognized. More than anything, this is a conversation about people and place. By following the lives of 5 families across generations, Jazmine brings a human lens to a complicated history, one that's rich with resilience, identity, and connection, and that adds real depth to our understanding of the American West. This is a thoughtful conversation with a very smart, purpose-driven author that adds some much-needed historical context to this current moment in American culture. I think you'll enjoy it, and I think you'll learn a lot. But before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank the people and organizations who make Mountain and Prairie possible. As always, the podcast is listener-supported through Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who supported the show in the past, does so now, or might do so in the future. It makes a really big difference. The podcast is also supported by a small group of values-aligned organizations, including the Central Grasslands Roadmap, the Nature Conservancy, North Bridger Bison, and the Old Salt Co-op. These are groups that I know very well and deeply admire, and I'm very grateful for their support. I also want to take a minute to mention that there's a lot more to Mountain and Prairie than just this podcast. There are a handful of different ways to follow along depending on how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go. Each week I send out a free email called Good News from the American West, which highlights interesting stories, conservation wins, events, job opportunities, and it's only positive things that are happening around the region. No outrage or negativity allowed. I've been sending these emails out every Wednesday for almost 6 years now, and I get tons of excellent feedback. I also send out a bi-monthly book recommendations email where I share a handful of books that I've read and I think you might enjoy. No fluff or filler, and there's really no particular genre or focus. It's just books I've read that have stuck with me for one reason or another. I've been doing these book recommendations for over 10 years now, and I continue to get great feedback on them. And if you're on social media, every so often I reinstall Instagram and LinkedIn on my phone, and I post pictures about new episodes or pictures from my life here in Colorado or other interesting or funny things that happen to catch my attention. But you all know how social media works by now. And then finally, there's Patreon, which is really the financial backbone of everything I do with Mountain and Prairie. If you want to support the work directly, Patreon gives you that option with tiers starting at just a couple of bucks a month. There are also some great extras that come along with being a Patreon supporter. I publish a monthly Patreon-exclusive podcast, which tends to be more personal than the main feed. It's often focused on books, lessons learned, or answering questions from the Patreon supporters. The most recent Patreon-exclusive episode I put out was about 30 minutes long, and it was about some of my favorite biographies or memoirs. There's also a behind-the-scenes newsletter where I share updates on projects, trips, and whatever else is going on in the background. And depending on your level of support, there are a few additional perks like stickers, occasional discounts, and early access to events. And speaking of support, I want to give a quick thank you to some of the recent folks who signed up on Patreon. Noel Kelly, JT Stumpf, Paul Puckett, Wills Combs, Romy Swanson, Amy Brooks, Jay Hinkie, and Chris Kurtz. Thanks to all these folks and everybody else who's supported over the years. I really, really, really appreciate it. So whether you just listen to the podcast, read the emails, follow along on social media, or support through Patreon, I really, really, really appreciate it. This whole thing works only because people care enough to pay attention, and I take that responsibility very, very seriously. So thank you. If you want to check any of it out, just go to mountainandprairie.com. And now let's get to this thoughtful conversation with Jazmine Ulloa. All right, Jazmine, very excited to chat with you, and I'm so glad we got introduced. And I was telling you before we started recording how much I absolutely love this book. I mean, I learned so much. At times, it can be very hard to read, and then thinking about everything that's happening in the world now, it can make it even more intense. But it's really a masterpiece, and it's perfectly timed for current events. And so I'm very happy that you took time to chat with me. So thank you so much. I was hoping that we could start out just talking a bit about you personally, because you and your family's history is so woven into this book. Can you just start out, like, we'll go all the way back and just tell me a bit about your family and you know who they are and how they ended up in El Paso?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, thank you for having me and thank you for your kind words. It's been truly, truly amazing. The reception has been just incredible. So thank you for that. Um, but yeah, so I I was born and raised in El Paso. My mom was born in El Paso but raised in Ciudad Juarez in a very humble barrio known as the Colonia Obrera, or the Barrio Obrera, which was known after its working class workers who crossed into the border every day and helped make El Paso what it is. They worked in factories and stores and shops and, clean homes. And my father is actually from Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, which is a state off of the Pacific coast in Mexico. Most people not now know it as a very beach, for the beach, for tourism, for multi-million dollar condos and the site of movies where movies have been filmed. But my dad was actually, he came from one of the wealthiest families when it was just a small little town, unknown town. And he went to study in Ciudad Juarez, across the border from El Paso, when it was home to one of the most prominent agricultural schools in the country. And at the time, he was very wealthy where he was from, but in Ciudad Juarez, which was a much larger, more progressive city even, and in many ways than El Paso, he was squarely middle class. And so I really loved talking. I really loved working on those chapters about the book, because growing up, I had always heard he was this rich kid. We call them fresas in Spanish, right? Which directly translates to strawberries, but but it actually means like junior, like the son of a rich kid. But his family lost everything during the 80s, when during the peso devaluations of the 80s, there was a lot of destabilization in Latin America after years of Cold War and drug war conflicts in the region. And so by the time that I was born, he was working as a mechanic on the other side of the border, learning English, and was very lucky in some ways that he got to pursue higher education. Lucky, but also it came down to his own fortitude and perseverance, willing to to put himself out there and knock on doors, and doors that weren't really built for people like us, or families like us. His intention had always been to return to Puerto Vallarta and cultivate the land that his family owned, and they did try that, but it didn't work out, and eventually they came back. And so that's where I was born. And so they split up when I was younger, and I moved back and forth between California and Texas, Southern California and Texas, for a while. And I explained this in the book. The easiest way to explain it is that my mom is a kind of a free spirit, in her own right. And so, she's also a luchona, like a guerrillera, like a fighter, and raised me and my younger sister, as a single mom eventually, even though we did have a good relationship with my dad. But El Paso to me was always home. I have a good group of friends, some of whom I've known since fourth grade, and we were wearing, we went to Catholic school together. So, but of course, growing up as most teenagers, I didn't really appreciate it, uh, for the city it was. It was too small. It felt too small. It felt too isolated. It sits, at the far western tip of Texas. It's closer to Phoenix than it is to the capital of Austin. So it's like this place that feels very misunderstood by the rest of Texas. And so when I went away to college to UT Austin, I I think that's when I first started to realize what a special place it truly was, right? It was this place that had allowed me to be as much Mexican as American, where I had learned to speak Spanish, and my mother and my grandmother would cross over into Ciudad Juarez and bring textbooks and history books and teach me Mexican history and Mexican stories that they had learned growing up. And then I still was learning English and American history on the other side of the border. And so I think that's when I first started to realize what a special place, what a unique and special place I had grown up in. And then, but it wasn't until I became a political reporter, a national political reporter for the Boston Globe, and I started to see El Paso become this backdrop to our nation's immigration battles, that I started to realize, it's more than just a special place. It's this foundational place for the country. It's been so critical to the United States from its foundation until now. And it's really only understanding its history that we begin to understand where we are today in the nation's immigration debate, how these immigration battles have shaped not only Latino identity, but American identity itself.
I'm curious, when did journalism come into your brain as a career? Because, you obviously you come from very tough parents, and the business you're in now has always been tough, but I feel like what you're covering at this specific time is really, I mean, you got to be tough. You got to work hard. I just don't even understand how you wrote this book while you were doing all the reporting. When did writing, you said you were talking about history was a big part of your growing up, but when did you decide that journalism was something that you'd want to focus on?
Yeah, I was always writing as a kid, and I was always reading. I really loved to read. My friends and I were always swapping books. The seed was planted. I used to watch a lot of Mexican novelas, telenovelas growing up, soap operas, Mexican soaps growing up. And those are usually about love entanglements, and the rich and the poor. The rich girl the poor girl marrying the rich guy, and they're mainly about that. But there was one novela where the main characters were actually journalists, and there were these scenes. There was this one scene where there was this breaking news event happening, and they were all trying to find information against the government, and just watching the whole newsroom assemble, I've never been so riveted by something before. and and it was more riveting than any of the love story, love triangle,
Yeah, yeah.
things to me, than like this collective action, for the good, for the truth. It was the first time that I was like really excited by that. My mother was a single mom. She had a lot of help, but from my grandmother and her sisters, my three aunts, and they were always pushing education. They, but like for most immigrant families, those paths tend to be, doctor or a lawyer, right? Professions that make money. Um, so that seed was planted, but it was just kind of in the background. I didn't really think it was a viable career path until I was in high school. I was a high school newspaper reporter under this. She's a legendary teacher in El Paso for Burgess. She was a journalism teacher for Burgess High School, Patricia Monroe. And she was just, she pushed her students hard. She treated us like real journalists, even though we were these, kids in high school. She was expecting us to get the story of the day. Even then, it was in the 2000s. It was in the aughts, and there had been a series of of murders on the other side of the border, of killings of women, of women were disappearing in the desert and had been since the 90s. And there were a lot of theories about what uh, were behind those, what was behind what, or who were behind the crimes. There were theories of drug cartel members and um, bad boyfriends and copycats, but whatever it was, these crimes were going uninvestigated. Their moms did not have any. They were going unresolved, right? Their moms did not have any answers, many answers, and these were women who um, looked like me, who were around the same age as me, and they were being found in tubs of acid. They were being, their bones were being dropped in the desert in these cotton fields. I had proposed that we do a series on those crimes, and I had reached out to some of the mothers, and I had managed to reach out to some of the mothers. The internet was still very new, but but there were already groups that were forming organizations and online, and so I've been able to track some of the mothers down. And of course, my high school teacher had a lot of reservations about it at first, but I told her, my grandmother's going to take me across the border. I didn't even have a driver's license. I was about 15, 16. I think I was 16 at the time. And so, yeah, so my grandmother took me across to one of these colonias, and it was one of these neighborhoods where the roads aren't paved. There's just dirt. There's just dirt roads. There's shoes hanging from electric phone lines, and it's just these humble homes. And I met a couple of the mothers in one of these homes, and of course, they told me these very horrid stories about their daughters, Silvia, Alejandra, Claudia. And one of the mothers took me, outside, and she pointed to house after house on the same block where a mother, a daughter, a sister had been lost. And then she took me inside, and another mother took me inside and showed me the bedroom, her daughter's bedroom. And it just looked so eerily similar to mine. She had Backstreet Boys posters on the wall, and Dallas Cowboys posters, and stuffed animals. And I just remember thinking, I had been kind of an angsty teen. I was pretty rebellious at the time. Straight A's, but still, or close to that, but of a troublemaker at home. And I remember just that moment, that realizing the privilege I had just for simply being born on the other side of the border. I think that's when I really started to think more deeply about the place where I was from, and to want to tell deeper stories about people and the border.
That just blows my mind thinking about when I was 16 years old and what and what I was doing, and you're taking that on. I mean, were you like, what was your mindset when you went over there with your grandmother? I mean, were you scared? Were you excited? Were you nervous? All of the above? I mean, it's hard. My daughter is going to be 11 soon, so that's 5 years out from that. And that is so impressive, and just almost like otherworldly to think about somebody being that focused and that brave and kind of focused on such a scary issue, but that a story that needs to be told. I mean, what was your mindset when you're going over there?
I was nervous, but I was also angry because I've been reading so many of the articles and doing so much of the research, and it just was disturbing to think that these crimes hadn't been investigated, that these mothers were still out here uh, begging for answers from their government. And I think a lot of us from the border, a lot of Juarenses, a lot of Latinas were angry about it. When I was actually working on the book and trying to recalling that chapter, though, I think what was more revealing to me was that I had never actually thought about that experience from the perspective of my journalism teacher or my grandmother herself. Like it was so many years later, and here I was like, whoa, what must I finally understood her reservations, because at the time I was just so adamant that we needed to do this, and and that we needed to go over there, and I didn't think about like how scared she must have been for me on her end, my teacher, my journalism teacher, how nervous she must have been for that, wanting me to pursue it as a story, because it's what she herself had taught and made sure made sure she wanted us to practice, right, to act like real journalists.
She's like, act like a real journalist, but maybe not that hardcore.
Yeah, yeah. And then my grandmother too, because so on the way back, we were actually headed back to El Paso. We start talking about the crimes and some of the reporting that I'd been doing, and I started telling my grandmother about, there's this lawyer and his son, and they've been defending these bus drivers that are accused of some of these crimes, but they're arguing that they're actually scapegoats for the government because there wasn't enough evidence, and some of these men were getting tortured. And so I tell her, I have the contact for the father. I have the contact information for the father, who heard his son get shot point blank on the phone. After these attorneys were targeted for defending these bus drivers, and so I had been trying to set up an interview with the father for the longest time, but every time I would call, he would tell me, yes, call me at this date. And yes, I want to do this interview. But then I'd call at the time he had told me to call, and he wouldn't answer the phone. And so I was telling her about this. And she said, do you have the address? And I said, yeah. And I pulled it out of this ratty notebook. And she said, let's go. And she took me there herself, and she drove me right to the front of the law office and made me go up the stairs, told me to go up the stairs and go knock on the door. And I think that's when I was the most nervous. That's when I had reservations because I was like, wait, what? Like, I was like, I don't know if I can do it. And she was the one who looked me in the eye and told me to go up there. And so and remembering that moment, I was thinking, well, she was sitting there too, and she was listening to the mothers tell me their stories. I never thought about how it must have felt for her as a mother, as a grandmother, to be listening, what that must have moved in her to then make me, tell me to be braver and go up there.
So impressive. And also, yeah, I think I just keep thinking about it through the lens of a father, my daughter, because on one hand, I would not be prouder. I could not be prouder. It would just be unbelievable to see that. But on the other hand, just absolutely terrified. Which I guess in some ways is like the story of parenting in a lot of ways. One thing about this podcast is one of the reasons I started it is because I would read about people like you when I was sitting in the office at Merrill Lynch, kind of bored and like, I want to do something more interesting. And I was obsessed with the people with stories like yours. And I just couldn't understand, like, how did they do this? And so I think it would be easy for somebody listening to this to hear about that part of your life. And then fast forward to today where you're with the New York Times, you got this awesome book that's being, just praised over and over by all these different organizations. But could you walk through just briefly your career path? Because it's not like you got out of UT Austin and just immediately went to the New York Times. You had to work your way up, if my LinkedIn stalking is correct. Can you just give kind of an overview of from college to where you are now?
Oh yeah, I graduated during at the end of the 2008 recession, when every newspaper and wire, it seemed, was on a hiring freeze or laying off people or restructuring. It was a very, very tumultuous time for the industry. I mean, not that it's much better today, but it was like the beginning of what we're seeing now in many ways. Um, and somehow through all of that, I managed to have a very traditional path upward, even in a very untraditional time. After graduating from UT, I'd done a couple of internships, and I was interning at the Boston Globe. And it used to be that when you were a senior graduating at the Globe, at least what I heard from that at that time was that you'd get an extra 6 months on your internship to be able to find a job. But they were not doing that for our class, for our internship class. But I ended up going back down to another place that I had interned, which was the Brownsville Herald. So I went from the western tip of Texas to the southern tip of Texas and started at a really small newspaper, just doing general assignments and covering. But at the same time, it put me at the front end of covering the rise of the drug war and this rise of migration, right? We were seeing another migration of Mexican families and asylum seekers crossing over into Texas. So it just put me on the front lines of that. And then I went on to do crime. I was covering crime out of San Antonio. I had belt like a radio, county, and fire radios strapped to my belt and chasing scenes, going out to really horrific scenes sometimes, talking to people at in the during some really really hard moments through really very very raw emotions. Then I went on to the Austin American Statesman, where I covered crime, but then I also started doing more state and federal courts and criminal justice, so following criminal cases through and civil cases through the courts. And then I went on to Sacramento I was covering state politics for the Los Angeles Times. And we moved right before the election of Donald Trump the first time. And so I went from a red state to a blue state. I was new city, new beat. I was completely new to covering politics. I had covered some politics in the other job, in the other gigs, because that's just what you do as a journalist. You sometimes have to cover a little bit of everything, and politicians often get in trouble with the courts. So it wasn't completely new, but at that level and at a paper of such high caliber, it was a very new environment, and in such a unique political moment that we were in as well. And then from there I went on to cover national politics for the Boston Globe from Washington, D.C. And then I went on to do, then a couple of years after that, I went on to the New York Times and was doing national politics on the campaign trail.
What would you say are some of the characteristics you have that have allowed you to continue to rise up and, eat with each job? It's kind of more and more responsibility, a bigger audience. I mean, it seems like it would be obviously skilled journalist, skilled writer, but it seems like there's a big portion of it that is endurance and the ability to work harder than most people and work hard on really, really tight deadlines. I mean, what would you say is kind of your specialty that has allowed you to continue to rise up like this? And I always get in trouble asking people like you this because they're humble and they kind of hem and haw, but just let it rip. What are you good at? What's the secret?
I think it just comes from just really wanting to tell these stories. That moment for me in high school and speaking to the mothers of these women was just such a powerful one. Like, I feel like I carry Claudia, Alejandra, and Silvia with me everywhere. Like I've just always wanted to tell a deeper story about where I'm from. Even if I'm covering crime or if I was covering courts or politics, I was trying to tell deeper stories. I was trying to come back to these deeper stories about the border, El Paso, immigration, Latinos, Latino voters. So Mexican Americans. I was always trying to come back to that story. So it was more like a sense of duty and a sense of purpose. Like there's just not that many Latino reporters out there. There's not that many Latino reporters out there that are from the border, and the border was just it's just become such a powerful symbol in our politics, right? And to be able to explain that, to be able to tell those richer stories about where I'm from was important to me. So I think that the purpose, just wanting to say something and wanting to explore something, the curiosity was just so much bigger to me than any obstacle in the way. It seemed like that has driven me. And I think the other thing is just the resourcefulness. Like, just people on the border are very resourceful.
That sense of duty is so powerful, and that's the thing on this podcast, whether I'm talking to some, military people or conservationists, or they're always driven by, it's not about them. It's about whatever the issue is that they're serving. So one more question about you. I could ask you questions about you for like 3 hours, but I want to talk about the book because it's so awesome. But you're driven by this sense of service to tell these stories. And so there's just kind of this compassion that's part of what you're doing. But I'm always curious talking to people who are working in scary or kind of trauma-filled environments. It seems like they're driven because they want to help people, but at the same time, you're seeing this really awful stuff, whether it's crime, whether, people losing their daughters. You're seeing a lot of people at their worst moments. And I'm curious, how do you turn it off, or how do you separate yourself enough so that it doesn't break you? Because I would think you're obviously extremely tough, but you're also very compassionate. And I would think at night when you're going to bed, some of these things that you've seen and people you've talked to and the awful situations they're in, it could, to me at least, it could drive me crazy, or break me, or burn me out, or just make it unable to actually separate yourself from the work. So, I mean, how do you keep that distance? It's like an emergency room doctor. Somebody comes in, they're bleeding to death. They can't be screaming and be panicking. They have to be a professional. And I feel like that's very similar to what you're doing. So how do you maintain that distance without losing your compassion?
I have a really strong family. I have a really, really good friends. It's been underscored even in the last few days in talking about these books and going out to events in different places in Texas, just the people who have come out to support and are reading and are connecting with it. I think it's been so, I think that level of support has just been so evident in those spaces. I've just seen it firsthand so much recently that I think I was actually just thinking about this, what you were asking me the other day. I think it's just having that strong support network. And of course, I have a therapist, of course, like especially after covering the El Paso mass shooting. I have a good partner. I have a good husband. He listens to me a lot. He's a reporter too, so he knows. He himself covered crime when we were younger. So I think like that, having that strong base of support has been critical.
Community is everything. I think humans are, we're through our whole, evolution, we're built to deal with trauma, but we have to have a community to help us deal with it. You can't deal with it in isolation. Not that I've seen anything even close to what you've seen, but let's talk about the book. Really, really, really amazing work. I love history. I love particularly narrative history, and I love learning about people. And so this book hit hit all of those parts. But the thing that I found very interesting about it, but also disturbing to me, is that I read so much history. I feel like I know a little bit about a lot of stuff, I should say. So much of this was brand new information to me. Even the most basic part, you talk about El Paso as being Ellis Island of the Southwest. Can you talk a bit about that idea, that theme of Ellis Island, and what a massive point of entry El Paso has been for so long for people of all nationalities?
I really felt like I was writing for two different audiences, right? I felt like I was writing for this national audience that often comes to understand El Paso or see El Paso and see the border through this lens of national security and the drug war and, the nation's immigration battles, and doesn't really understand it as this binational, bicultural place where people kind of have ebbed and flowed through for generations, right? And then I felt like I was also trying to write for fronterizos, people like me who know that binational, bicultural world, those two worlds, those two languages so intimately, but then still don't even see how rich, who still, even for us, a lot of that history is lost or has been forgotten, or so trying to broaden our understanding of the place where we're from as well. I've been talking about this a lot. Ellis Island, we hold it up as this symbol of our most sacred ideals of welcoming the other, right? Or we debate it, as a symbol of how we fall short of those ideals. But regardless, we still put it at the center of our national story, right? Of our national telling. To me, it was about showing how El Paso is the American city that most tells us about our nation's immigration battles today. How it's been this gateway, this critical gateway into the land that would become the United States long before Ellis Island ever existed. And it's been this, portal for Mexican and Chinese laborers and Black cowboys and white entrepreneurs, who have built the Southwest as we know it. And so that's the case that I'm trying to make in the book, is that it deserves its rightful place, not at the margins, but at the center of our story. That this history has been overlooked matters, because without it, we don't understand that there is no as Hispanic invasion of the United States, that, the Latino workers that are now being called invaders and criminals, like that couldn't be further from the truth. Mexican American culture and history have always been part of who we are. And this ebb and flow of largely blue collar, Mexican American, Mexican American, Latino workers, and not only blue collar workers, but intellectuals and activists have been part of forging the American Southwest as we know it.
Do you think that the fact that El Paso is relatively unknown, like compared to Ellis Island or compared to like San Francisco, kind of these ports of entry that every school kid learns about when they're learning their basic history of the United States, you just don't learn about El Paso, or at least I didn't, and until really reading your book. Do you think that kind of lack of history or lack of understanding or kind of a mystery around it has been one of the reasons that people have been able to spin it in a way that's out of control and untrue and scary, and been able to kind of tell these stories that are not typically based in reality to get people all spun up, like the shooter and the Walmart shooter that you write about? Do you think that it's almost like this unknown place that, and we humans, when something's unknown, we get scared of it? Do you think that that's part of why it's been able to be spun in these weird directions and scary directions?
Yes, 100%. I mean, as I say in the opening of the book, we tend to think of the border of just this thin strip of, land that we project the basest fears of the outsider onto, right? And when really it's this broad swath, when really the American Southwest was this broad swath of native, indigenous, Spanish, Mexican land, with so many influences, and all of that is still very much ingrained in our culture and who we are. And so that was what was so crucial to me to show.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you tell, it's just awful. It's so awful, but it is a very important part of the book. Can you talk about the 2019 shooting and how that kind of led you into thinking more deeply about writing this book?
I was a national politics reporter at the time for the Globe in DC when it happened. And I was actually in a movie theater when my phone just started buzzing. And I think this was true for many El Pasoans all over the country, because this was like a seismic event that just, the waves just went outward. I think that was the first time that I realized what an Ellis Island it was, right? Because so many people had connection to El Paso all over the country when this the shooting broke out, and we're texting each other on text chains and on social media. And I covered it for the Globe, just did a quick hit for the Globe, but a day or two later, I was on a plane back home, and this was a massacre that affected people who I knew and loved, right? I had gone to high school 3 minutes away from where it happened. I'd spent a lot of time as a teenager out there in those shopping plazas and the Cinemark, the movie theater right next door, and in the Walmart itself. And my best friend's father was actually in the parking lot when the shooting broke out. So I thought I had thick skin. We've talked about the crime reporting. I thought I had thick skin, but this was one of those assignments that I'll never forget. It was one of the hardest I've ever had to cover. And trying to hold it together as I'm, at the scene, reporting from the scene, and running into people I know, reporters who themselves I know to be very tough, are in tears. So it was just a very emotional experience for all of us as a city, collectively, as El Pasoans and as reporters and as fronterizos. And like I said, I was a politics reporter, so I had I had already been seeing El Paso kind of coming into the national conversation, but I was seeing it again through this lens of tragedy and migrants, and people were already calling it the new Ellis Island, or the Ellis Island of the Southwest. But in this new Ellis Island, we were watching, migrants getting penned underneath the bridges in El Paso. We were watching children getting separated at the border. That's when I really started to think about, how do I tell a deeper story here? I want to come back. I don't want to be one of these journalists who just parachutes in and out. especially because I was so frustrated by that type of reporting growing up, being from a place where people parachute in and out. I think that's when I really, really started to think about how can I go back? How can I explore this incident, this this massacre as not as this rupture in our history, but part of this much larger legacy. And how do I, and as I started doing the research for that, really trying to get people to see that our southern borderlands have always been this rich, multiracial, multi-ethnic region where forces of conservatism and liberalism and white supremacy and the resistencia to that have always kind of been at odds, where identities can collide and collapse into each other, and people can forge these new forms of culture and connection despite the many waves of hate and division that have swept the country through the eras.
One of the things I love about reading history is it allows me to see, like, all right, we've been here before, we've had these kind of problems before, but then the other side of that is it's very frustrating to me because in some ways we keep repeating the same problems over and over. And there's one scene in the book, I think it was like 1913, and you lay out this scene where the United States has cannons aimed down at Mexico from El Paso. And there, all this tough guy talk about we got to protect the border and we can't have all these people coming in. Yet there's just desperate need on the United States side of things for people to build the railroads, to do agriculture, to be miners. And it's like all this talk saying nobody can come in, yet there's this blatant need and talk that we need workers. And so that's 1913. Fast forward to today, and we're still doing the same thing. And so, like, how does it make you feel? Or are you more on the side of, well, it's very nuanced, so I don't think it's one answer or the other, but how do you think about that, about us repeating the same problem, the same issues over and over and over versus learning from our mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot because we're once again as on the front lines of the harshest immigration campaign, detention and deportation campaign this country has seen since World War II as reporters, and not just as immigration reporters, politics reporters, health reporters. Immigration is touching everything right now in this country. We're all immigration reporters in some form or fashion, and being in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in DC, and watching these scenes play out where I'm, on the street talking to Latinos. In Chicago, I was the first person that I actually interviewed was this undocumented construction worker who was from Ciudad Juarez, and he had worked in restaurants, had worked in factories. It was just so he just echoed the stories of the people in the book so well. It was just so emblematic of that migratory experience through El Paso. So I've been thinking a lot about how so many of the scenes that we're seeing playing out today, we've seen before, whether it's the surveillance tactics, the sweeps and the raids, the military style tactics that we're seeing on the street, people getting operations that are entangling legal residents as much as American citizens, and that harsh nativist rhetoric. And I think it goes back to that. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, not knowing El Paso's history, not knowing that a lot of people, not knowing that we've been here before. I mean, that's why I felt so compelled to write this, right? As I was working on this book, immigration was just becoming a more and more salient issue with each election cycle. And I was so and I wrote this book really going from and telling these stories. I was traveling from Dallas to Chihuahua, across Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. I mean, I went as far as Guatemala, and I was digging through these dusty archives and visiting museums and interviewing, historians and scholars in not just the US, but Mexico and Guatemala. And it was really quickly becoming apparent to me that I was telling a story that many people didn't know. A lot of Mexicanos, because at the same time as I'm digging through these archives, I was, attending campaign rallies and trailing candidates and going to Trump rallies. And I was talking to all kinds of voters, American voters in Ohio and Iowa and Texas and Latino voters. And like I said, it was just becoming very apparent to me that I was telling a story that many Mexicanos didn't know. And I remember talking to Latino voters themselves, Latino Republicans, about the administration's agenda and their plans for mass deportation, because President Trump and his advisors were already citing Operation Wetback, which is named after a racial slur, as 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 their model for carrying out this campaign, right? Which was this operation under the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s that was used to round up Mexican laborers and Mexican American laborers, um, and put them onto to boats and planes and send them back to Mexico, right? And so I'm explaining to some of these Latino Republicans about that operation, that it's based on this operation, and they're some of them are laughing at me. They're like, I had one woman saying, "No way, that did not happen," and I'm like, "No, yes, you can Google it," and it's like, "No way, they would have called an operation after that. What are you talking about? Why would they? That's so offensive." So to me, it's just this, what I'm saying. I think it's the failure of not knowing this history has gotten us where we are today.
One thing that struck me, again, there are these very clear parallels between things that have happened in El Paso and on the border and how they continue to happen over. But I'm from the South, as you can probably tell from this accent, and I started thinking about just the racial things that have happened in the South, with Reconstruction all the way up to civil rights integration in the South. And it just, I know you're a historian and a journalist, not an anthropologist, but I just kept thinking, I think there's just something in us humans to where we're always going to be coming back to these issues, because there's the Jim Crow laws, and then you mentioned something in the book that I never heard, and they call it the Juan Crow laws, and it just seemed like there was so much overlap in the mindset of the American South from post Civil War to civil rights integration that mirrored in a lot of ways everything that's happening on the border from the 1890s up until today. Do you think there is just there's just something in us humans to where we want to close the door behind us, or there's always going to be a group trying to hold down other groups? I mean, I know that's kind of a big question, but that just popped into my head as I was reading this.
I was trying to lean into that complexity and that nuance. That I was really trying to show El Paso as, it has been this center of, like I said, this center of where you see white supremacy and mestizaje and the resistencia, right? To both of those theories, where we do see these forces of division and connection. So I think that part of it is always going to be cyclical, but I think with each cycle, more and more people are starting to know this history and starting to connect the struggles, right? Whether it's Black, Latino, and Asian struggles, indigenous struggles. I feel like people are. I mean, you see it in Minneapolis. You see it in the pushback in Minneapolis. I haven't seen so many people. That's another thing. I keep coming back to, is that a lot of the strategies and tactics and, these aggressive strategies and tactics to deport and detain and identify so-called undocumented people aren't new. A lot of the strategies to push back aren't new. They were developed by Latino and Black civil rights groups and activists in the 90s and even further back during the civil rights movement. So it's not new, but the way it seems to be affecting society now, and it seems to be cutting across all facets of life, especially as I saw it in Minneapolis. You had people coming out in their pajamas and their running gear and their yoga pants to shout at ICE agents. I mean, that I had never seen before, and I didn't really see in the history book. So that does seem new to me.
One of the many things I loved about the book was how you focused on the 5 different families. And I feel like no matter what somebody's opinions are about immigration or about really any issue, when you really get to know people that are affected by any particular issue and you understand their background, where they're from, why they're doing what they're doing, it can, even if you disagree with people on an issue, you can have some compassion and some understanding about why they're doing what they're doing, and you can still have some respect, even if you happen to still disagree. Can you talk about why you decided to structure the book this way versus just a straight up history or more of a straight up journalism, but versus weaving your own history in there, and then the really intimate details of all these other families?
I really, really wanted it to be focused on the families and how immigration had shaped these families and how they in turn had shaped the city and the country, right? Through these experiences. That also gets at the complexity that I was talking about leaning into that complexity, right? Because there's always rules in society, but then it's just how do those rules actually play out on the ground? How do they bend and how are they bent and broken and turned into something else? And you really do see that on the border, right? And that's why I was trying to show it was not just a story about the violence at the border, the bloodshed at the border, but that different kind of blood, that family blood, right? I talk about the Black music scene that thrived in Ciudad Juarez, right, during its golden years, and how it was this place where someone from the Midwest, a guy called Michael from the Midwest could become Miguelito in Ciudad Juarez. That's why I really wanted to lean into the people, because it's only in leaning into the people that you can see how it plays out in real life. And then in searching out the families, I was really trying to capture families who were very emblematic of these critical turns in Mexican and American and border history, and that were emblematic of that migratory, that ebb and flow that's been unique to El Paso and the Frontera. When I went out searching, that's what I was searching for. And so some of the families I had met as I was reporting, like the Rubio sisters, who were born in Ciudad Juarez and deported as children, crossed into Texas and deported as children, and then go on to serve in the California legislature to become the first sisters to ever do so. I had actually covered while I was a State House reporter in Sacramento, and there was this class of Latino lawmakers who were part of the Democratic leadership that were now positioning the state as this bastion of progressive resistance to that first Trump administration. And so one of the sisters was actually on the floor and name-checked El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And of course, I went up to her afterward and was like, "Ha, you're from where I'm from," and we chatted. And some of the others I found, through the research itself, like Erlinda Wang Chu, I had actually seen photos of her growing up in El Paso, because there's this very prominent photo of a soldadera, which is like a female combatant of the Mexican Revolution. And, she has a big hat, a big sombrero, and a bandolier, a belt of bullets across her chest. And, she's dressed all in this black flowing gown. And I had seen that photo and I had thought it was actually a Yaqui indigenous woman, and she's identified as such in some of the captions. But in doing the research, I come to find she's actually a China Mexicana. And so, of course, I was curious about, like, well, are her descendants still alive? And they were. And as I was doing the research, I find that they're actually prominent immigration lawyers and judges, and that they've been shaped by their grandmother's experience. And one of them actually had the direct tie back to the shooting.
Don't reveal it. That's my goal on these podcasts. Sometimes authors come on podcasts, they tell all the details, then nobody buys the book. My goal is, like, you got to tease it just enough, and then everybody, and buy copies for your friends for birthdays, holidays.
Yeah. But it was really about, like, I think it's through the people that you can really see the complexity of the place and the bonds that form, despite, like I keep saying, these really violent forces of division, of race, of class.
Sometimes, or most of the time, when I really dig deep into something and I really feel like I'm starting to get an understanding of something, all that ends up happening is I realize how nuanced it all is. And like, I used to, in a previous life, I was in the conservation world, and I did a lot of stuff about water in the West. And every time I would learn something new about water, it would open up 10 new things I didn't know. So then on a relative basis, I actually knew less than I did when I got started. And I'm curious, you dug so deep into this. The book is so nuanced, and it really demonstrates the complexity of everything. Do you feel like Do you feel like you know on a relative basis less than you did when you started, or do you feel like you've got a pretty good, a much better idea of your hometown?
I feel like I got a deeper understanding of my hometown. I feel like I learned things I never had learned before. I hadn't learned in school. I hadn't seen in books before. I didn't know, for example, that the Chinese referred to El Paso as this beacon of hope, right? That they called it that during the years of Chinese exclusion in the United States. I didn't know how I didn't understand how that anti-immigrant sentiment, that anti-Chinese sentiment had proliferated across the United States. I knew some of that history. I didn't know it that deeply. I certainly didn't know how it had also uh, was proliferating the other side of the border as well. I didn't know that there were so many Mexican intellectuals and activists and journalists, independent journalists, who had crossed through El Paso and saw it as this intellectual hub. So much of that intellectual history of the border has just been completely erased. And the fact that it's not, we tend to think, there's this, we as reporters, we write a lot about, this rise in anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism, and we associate a lot of these ideas about or we write about how people tend to associate these ideas of equality and fair workers' rights and fair wages with the elites, or with that they're coming out of this ivory tower and aren't really associated to the people on the ground. But in El Paso, you can see that's completely opposite. A lot of these independent journalists were printing shops. One of them was actually printing. One of them actually lived right next to me. I came to find as I was doing the research. But they were printing shops out of downtown El Paso, and the way and they were distributing these newspapers that were promoting these very progressive ideas that we're still debating today, whether it was fair work wages and hours, demanding that discrimination against Mexican workers in the United States be ended, or be addressed. All these ideas were in these newspapers that were being carried from California to the southern tip of Texas, to northern Mexico, to the southern tip of Mexico, and they were being carried by blue collar workers, and many times some of them who couldn't even read themselves, but were having other people on other workers who could read to them at construction sites and mines, as they were organizing not only with Mexican workers and Mexican American workers, but with white workers in the Midwest. So I think that that's just such a fascinating history that's been lost. So I feel like I have a better understanding about my hometown, but there's definitely threads to this that I want to keep exploring, and that I want to keep exploring in a different book.
Well, we'll tease that. We were joking before we started recording that we'll go ahead and get it scheduled for 3 years out. So when that comes out, we can have a conversation. One question about your writing process. How did you, I don't understand how you got this book researched, written while working as a hardcore journalist for the New York Times. I don't like how did you manage your time? And I'm asking you this because I'm I like complain about not having enough time to work on my own writing stuff, and that's completely a nonsense excuse after talking to you. How did you get this thing done while also having another full-time job?
Oh man, I lived in it. I lived in it, breathed it. I was thinking about it when I wasn't on my work hours. I was, when I wasn't working, I was writing. I was writing everywhere. Like I said, I had it got especially tough when I joined the Times, because that is a grueling job as a campaign reporter. You can be in 3 different states in a week. You can be in 2 different cities in a day. And you always have to have a bag packed. Like I always had a bag partially packed, because you might have to head out at any moment, and so it was just a lot of discipline. I think I had done a lot of the work ahead of time as I prepared the pitch. I think I did a lot of the thinking through structurally what I wanted it to say, thinking through the heart of it, like the guiding the guiding north star, I guess, of the book. I had this Velcro wall in our office with timelines of Mexican history, border history, and then all of the families. Each family had a timeline of significant events in their lives, so that I could better see the connections in years and eras. And so I would just kind of portion it out. I would take books with me. I know, again, as a campaign reporter, you become very close to the people that are in the same travel and the same press pool as you. If you're trailing the same candidate, you become very close. So some of those reporters saw me reading in motorcades and airplanes. When I wasn't on assignment, if I wasn't on deadline, I had books with me from certain eras, or yeah. So just being as disciplined as one can be, right? Also taking care that sometimes you just need to rest and not do anything, but just sit on the couch and sleep. This book was really written in across the country, in hotels and coffee shops, on the tarmac.
All right, I have no more excuses. Two more questions for you, if you don't mind. You mentioned reading has been a big part of your life for as long as you can remember. And I'm always interested to learn from all these impressive people that I get to talk to, what are some of the books that have been most impactful? And they don't necessarily have to be about anything related to your work, but I'd love to hear if you have a few books that you think about as really kind of helping you become the person that you've become.
Yeah, I mean, growing up younger, my favorite book was like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. Luis Alberto Urrea, who's actually related to one of the characters in the book, that Teresa Urrea. His work, I mean, he's a journalist, but he also has such a beautiful voice, and I feel like I was really trying to get away from the daily grind, from the daily journalism grind as I was writing this, right? I was really trying to invoke the voices that I grew up with, my mother and my grandmother, their storytelling. On my father's side, my grandfather and my uncle are just like really great storytellers. And I really wanted it to feel like it was Mexicanos talking to you, The Devil's Highway. I really like Slaughterhouse-Five, like Kurt Vonnegut.
I just bought that. It just showed up in the mail and I have not yet read it, but it's sitting on my bedside table.
I just love his humor. Like I love his writing. And then of course I had people from my own, from where I'm from, like Alfredo Corchado, who wrote Midnight in Mexico, whose sister was actually my first newspaper editor when I was a high school reporter, and who edited that series we were talking about, the femicides. So I think I was drawing on inspiration from others, but also from where I'm from.
Those are all great. Thank you. We'll have links for people listening. If you're driving, don't be writing those down. They're on the webpage. You can go and click through. So final question for you. Your work has just, you've seen so much. You're doing such important work. You're telling these stories that need to be told. I always like to just kind of leave with asking for people to give me kind of some parting words of wisdom, anything you'd like the listener to take away from this. Again, I'm going to encourage people to grab the book because it's, you'll learn a lot, and I developed just a whole new perspective on the people and the issues. And I just thank you so much for writing it. But any way you'd like to wrap up this meandering, crazy barrage of questions from me?
No, I mean, I just always tell people, remember where you're from, remember where you came from, remember who helped you get there, stay true to your roots, and go interview your grandparents, go interview your parents. You just never know how crucial who that interview might interest someday. In one of the a critical interview I got for this book, and trying to recreate the journey of Miguel Martinez, who was one of the laborers who crossed through in the book. He was taken up by Pancho Villa's army, and it was really hard to recreate his life story because there's just not that many records from that time. Mexicanos don't keep their records when they're crossing over the border and getting lured into a rebel faction. It was actually a nephew of a historian that had interviewed his grandfather for a project that it was the reason why I even had a surviving relative speaking about that moment and what they had heard. So you just never know who might be listening.
I love that. I think that's great advice. Really, this was so great. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're going 100 miles an hour, which seems to be standard for you. But I just really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk, and most importantly, for putting this important work into the world. I hope we can stay in touch because I'm a super fan. Whatever you write, I'm going to read. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. As always, Mountain and Prairie is listener supported through Patreon, with additional generous support from the Central Grasslands Roadmap, the Nature Conservancy, North Bridger Bison, and the Old Salt Co-op. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more from me, you can sign up for my weekly email, Good News from the American West. It features a handful of quick, feel-good stories from around the West. No outrage, no inflammatory nonsense, just positive, uplifting, and occasionally funny stories that might improve your day. I also send out a bi-monthly book recommendation email, which is a separate email list that you can sign up for through the website. For those of you who like social media, you can find me on Instagram or LinkedIn. But really, the best place to go for everything is mountainandprairie.com. A huge thank you to my editor and producer, Keely Larson, for her care, creativity, and craftsmanship in putting these episodes together. And, as always, thank you for listening.